Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Tuesday, March 11, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Alexander Vindman, an author and a retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel who was a director of European Affairs for the United States National Security Council. Welcome, Alex. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, and thanks for coming back again. To start off with, as usual, can you give our audience some information about your professional background?
Sure. So, long military career, 22 years of military service. That was on the back end of being raised in New York City and immigrating to the US from Ukraine in 1979. My positions in the military included deployments to combat in Iraq, being stationed in the US Embassy in Kyiv, Ukraine, Moscow, Russia for 3 years, advanced degrees from Harvard. My doctorate is from Johns Hopkins. Stint in the Pentagon where I wrote the strategy for the U.S. Military with regards to dealing with Russia as a threat actor, and then the White House where I was the director for European Affairs, including for Russia and Ukraine.
To get right into it, why do you think President Donald Trump is putting more pressure on President Zelenskyy of Ukraine to accept a ceasefire and not so much pressure on President Putin of Russia?
Because he doesn't understand the lessons of history. What President Zelenskyy attempted to point out to Donald Trump in that meeting in the White House was that Russia could not be trusted. Russia breaks its agreements. But Donald Trump doesn't really care to learn the lessons of the past. Everything is transactional, what he can potentially do uh, in a deal right in front of him. That's part of it. He also has a general proclivity for Putin. He considers him a potential friend, somebody to emulate as a unconstrained dictator, and he has a deep animus towards Ukraine and President Zelensky because he believes that Ukraine is responsible for the first impeachment, when in fact it was Donald Trump and my reporting of Donald Trump's scheme to pressure Ukraine to deliver an investigation on then Vice President Joe Biden. So it was that all that comes together to put pressure on Ukraine and accommodate and flatter Russia.
As we speak, Ukraine and the United States are sitting around a table in Saudi Arabia to talk about the war and how to end the war. Will anything positive come out of these discussions?
I think that the U.S. is trying to see how much Ukraine is willing to compromise. It's a delicate series of discussions because Ukraine doesn't want to offer anything that is then announced to the Russians. The US is not fully trusted to be a fair arbiter or to be an ally, which was, even if we were imperfect under the Biden administration, we could still be trusted. And this is a new landscape for Ukraine. I think the US counterparts there, they may very well look to see if there's a deal to be had where Ukraine maybe even gives up quite a bit and is willing to compromise quite a bit to achieve a peace. And then from there, they'll take that back to the White House and see if they can get the Russians on board. That's a lot of ifs. And I think that the biggest factor here is that Russia is not willing to compromise. Russia wants to dominate Ukraine. The White House is missing that as a fundamental condition for the end of this war. And it's hard to see how this results in peace. If anything, this approach is likely to delay peace because it puts maximum pressure on Ukraine, where the US has a lot of influence, alleviates pressure on Russia, where the US had much more limited influence, and the conditions aren't set for a compromise.
Do you think President Zelenskyy of Ukraine is willing to give up territory in the Russian occupied territories for a peace deal?
He's willing to do that in a format that is temporary. He's willing to do that in exchange for security guarantees that would somehow ensure that Russia is not able to lick its wounds and come back and seize more territory. I think that, and he's willing to do that in a condition where Russia is also significantly compromising on its stated objectives that include Ukraine demilitarized, Ukraine neutral, Ukraine brought to heel under Russian influence. I think a situation, this is very far-fetched at the moment, a situation in which Ukraine maintains its sovereignty and territorial integrity, even if it temporarily has to give up territory, let's say for maybe even the next 10, 20 years. We're talking about the duration of Putin's reign and pariah status. That might be an acceptable circumstance. But one in which Ukraine is it's necessary for Ukraine to give up territory in perpetuity. That's out of the question, I think.
In your opinion, does the average American really care about what happens in Ukraine?
I do believe that's the case. I think it's been, frankly, a pretty steady state of support. The latest poll I saw has about the mid to high 60s support, bipartisan across Republicans and Democrats. I don't think that the American public embraced Trump and Vance's behavior in the Oval Office, the way that Trump attempted to beat up and pressure and humiliate Zelenskyy is broadly rejected, except for the extreme elements of the U.S. body politic, the MAGA landscape. The reason I think is pretty fundamental. It's a little bit about who we are. We like the underdog. It's been ingrained that the Russians are our enemies. I mean, we saw that through Russia's hostile activities throughout most of the 20th century, with a small reprieve at the beginning of the 21st century. And that Ukraine is a country that we've been supporting for years, and we understand that the Ukrainians are brave fighters defending intuitively, if not explicitly, that the Ukrainian fighters are defending Europe and democracy. Now, sometimes this gets muddled and watered down. The Biden administration didn't do nearly enough to make the case for why we should be supporting Ukraine, and the Trump administration and the Trump campaign beforehand attempted to cast Russia as the good guy and Ukraine as the bad guy. So that sometimes causes some sort of oscillations in support, but there has been a steady state of support, and I think that the president's behavior over the course of the past weeks is unpopular.
And why is Vice President J.D. Vance so openly hostile to President Zelenskyy?
Mainly because I think he's catering to Donald Trump's wishes. He's being a loyal henchman, where Donald Trump doesn't necessarily have to get his hands dirty, and JD Vance is happy to do that. I think historically, JD Vance has been critical of Trump and supportive of kind of a Reagan-esque policy, but since running for Senate and certainly since campaigning with Donald Trump, he's been far, far more loyal and looking to deliver on the boss's needs. In addition to that, I think you're seeing from that White House meeting in the Oval Office a display of maximum malice and maximum ignorance. Malice in that there is little care for Ukraine and a desire to normalize, reset relationships or relationships with Russia, something that we've seen play out across multiple administrations, and ignorance on the basis of the fact that that they don't seem to learn the lessons of the past, and that this is not an effective way to constrain Russia's aggression or support an ally. So Vance is really, unfortunately, somebody that is not a counterpart, a complementary type of vice president that will maybe make up for some of the shortcomings of Trump. He will feed the worst instincts of Trump.
Can Ukraine survive in a continued war with Russia with only European support and aid?
Yeah, I think that there is no immediate threat to Ukraine's existence, and I think, frankly, this is more speculative, but even in the long term, Russia simply doesn't have the strength to completely to achieve its battlefield outcomes. What you have is a situation in which Ukraine is neither Ukraine or Russia are strong enough to achieve their military objectives. Ukraine isn't strong enough to liberate its territory. Russia isn't strong enough to dominate Ukraine. But you do have a condition in which, absent U.S. support, the scales kind of shift in Russia's favor. It doesn't happen immediately; it happens over time. I think the idea that there will be, dire immediate effects is far-fetched. I think there's an impact from cutting some intelligence support, and that Ukraine can employ long-range fires. The ability to intercept Russia's cruise missiles will become more acute. The difficulties will become more acute over time, over the course of weeks and months really. Artillery also, we're talking about a 4 to 6 month time horizon. But a lot of what Ukraine needs, especially in the drone warfare capability, is produced indigenously. So those advantages won't become readily apparent until later. And the interesting thing is that the Europeans could play a large part in alleviating some of these things as they become more acute, if they make the decision to support Ukraine adequately. Part of that is financial support. I think they'll be able to buy resources for Ukraine, including from the U.S. The U.S. might be cutting off its own funded support for Ukraine. But if the Europeans want to buy, I don't think the Trump administration is going to impede that. And then, of course, if the Europeans start to invest in their own defense industrial base, that will take some time to come online, but that's another solution. So, yes, Ukraine can survive. It potentially could become more acute, depending on these different mixes of formula, whether the Europeans are going to be there or not. But Ukraine will survive, and Russia is just simply not strong enough in the short, medium term, really through 2025 to do any particularly deal any particularly disastrous blows.
Has Ukraine's support eroded in the U.S. Congress? And if so, why?
Yes, I think it has eroded mainly because you don't have anybody willing to stand up to Donald Trump. You could see that play out in what the stark differences are. In the first Trump administration, you had Reagan Republicans that were going to challenge the president. You had similar type of professionals in the White House that were going to counsel the president to be potentially more thoughtful, more balanced, more restrained in his embrace of Russia. That there is no such figures here, certainly not publicly. Behind the scenes, some of this is likely happening with the cabinet and with the Congress, but nobody's going to challenge the president directly. And the problem is that emboldens the president, that kind of gives him the belief that he's acting correctly, and this is, of course, a very dangerous turn. Part of the reason that we had that disastrous Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and Trump is that he was thinking that he could humiliate Zelensky and still get this deal. And Zelensky had to stand his ground. Zelensky probably shouldn't have had that meeting in the first place, but when he did, I think he handled it about as well as he could have, because he couldn't look weak for his troops fighting on the front lines, for the Ukrainian population that needed to understand that that leader was going to continue to fight for them, and he needed to show strength to Putin. He couldn't allow Trump and Vance to get away with spinning a yarn about the fact that the Russians were, somehow not the barbaric, aggressive, imperialist power that we've been witnessing the past 3 years.
Alex, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I do have one more question. Please tell us about your new book, The Folly of Realism: How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine.
So that the subtitle pretty much says it all. The only thing I would change is to change it to present tense. How the West deceives itself about Russia and betrays Ukraine. Because this has been a continuous theme for the past six administrations. I look at the period from George H.W. Bush and Ukraine's independence in that infamous Chicken Kiev speech, where the U.S. tried to tamp down on Ukraine's desires for independence. The episode around the denuclearization of Ukraine and the Budapest Memorandum, Orange Revolution, how the U.S. failed to adequately support Ukraine, under the Yushchenko government when there was a real strong and clear desire to align with the West, or 2014, where the Obama administration didn't provide sufficient support to Ukraine after Russia's aggression and seizure of parts of Ukraine, and all the way through President Biden and Trump. I would say that the Trump administration is, in a lot of ways, it's hard to see that it's continuous and consistent with the mistakes of the past because it's so excessive and so extreme. But it is really putting a Russia first policy that's been evident in the U.S. approach to Ukraine for almost 35 years, and then that we could do better. The book is also talks about how the U.S. could have a much more long-sighted view and support for Ukraine. So it's a pretty interesting, as far as I'm concerned, it's a pretty interesting story talking about some critical moments in the relationship. My own firsthand experience serving in Ukraine, serving in Russia, serving in the Pentagon, serving in the White House, and my observations from that period of time with a lot of interesting color. So definitely, if you want to learn more about what happened, how we got to this war, and how we could do better, I think it's an interesting thing to pick up and read.
Alex, where can our audience find your book today?
It just made the New York Times bestseller list, so you could of course find it on Amazon, your local bookstore, Barnes and Noble. It's any major location will have it, and you could also find me on Substack at evenman.com.
Alex, thank you so much for coming back and joining us today on Krynica.
Of course, do побачення.
Take care. I have been speaking with Alexander Vindman, an author and a retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel who was the Director of European Affairs for the United States National Security Council. This episode of Krynica is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Until next time, that's all for now.